Welcome back to this next video in which we are studying bipolar disorder. Okay, so in the previous video we went over the basics. We discussed what bipolar disorder is and what individuals suffering from bipolar disorder will actually go through, i.e. Depressive episodes and manic episodes. In this video we're going to study something called the monoamine hypothesis. Now, the monoamine hypothesis, it is a theory that attempts to explain depressive episodes and manic episodes, and therefore attempts to provide an explanation for what happens in unipolar depression and bipolar disorder. Therefore, the monoamine hypothesis is often called the monoamine hypothesis of mood disorders. Now, this is just a theory. It is, at present, our best theory of what happens in the mood disorders, the most respected, most textbook example of a theory of what happens in the mood disorders. However, be aware the spirit in which we are studying this, which is, it's a nice theory, a very beautiful theory, a very simple theory, which will help us to gain some sort of understanding as to what's actually happening in these disorders, but it may well turn out to be complete rubbish, and in 100 years' time they may be singing a very different song. So that's the spirit with which we are studying this. So without further ado then, let's actually study the monoamine hypothesis. What does this theory say? So of course the stars of this theory are the monoamines. So firstly, let me tell you about what the monoamines are. So the monoamines are a group of neurotransmitters that are used within the brain. Now, neurotransmitters are, of course, molecules that are released by one nerve cell to affect the behavior of another nerve cell. Now, the major two neurotransmitters in the brain are not monoamines. The major two neurotransmitters within the brain are glutamate and GABA. Glutamate excites neurons to fire action potentials. GABA inhibits neurons from firing action potentials. So the major two neurotransmitters of the brain, they affect the behavior of other nerve cells by changing the likelihood that that nerve cell is going to fire an action potential. In the case of glutamate, making it more likely. In the case of GABA, making it less likely. Now, the monoamines are far rarer neurotransmitters than glutamate and GABA. Nearly all the nerve cells in your brain, and indeed in your central nervous system, will be using glutamate or GABA as their neurotransmitter. Hardly any use these monoamine neurotransmitters. And the monoamine neurotransmitters, they do not behave in the same way as glutamate and GABA do. They are not neurotransmitters that will change the behavior of nerve cells by changing the likelihood that they will fire an action potential or not. They have much longer term effects than that. Glutamate and GABA have a very short term effect on the behavior of a nerve cell. They change here and now, is it going to fire an action potential or not? The monoamines do different things to that. They regulate the behavior of nerve cells metabolically for much, much longer. They change the nerve cells' behavior for much longer, and the changes in behavior that they produce are not simply, is this neuron going to fire an action potential here and now? And they're much longer term effects, what they're going to do to nerve cells, all sorts of effects on the nerve cells that will carry on for much longer and will influence for a long time the behavior as far as action potentials is concerned of those neurons. So the monoamines are believed to perform this regulatory, modulatory function, therefore, and they, according to the monoamine hypothesis, may well be the neural correlate of things like mood, things like energy, things like volition. So, without further ado then, let's actually introduce the monoamine neurotransmitters. So there are 3 monoamine neurotransmitters. Easily the most famous of the monoamine neurotransmitters is serotonin, often abbreviated down to 5-HT. Now, how do you end up abbreviating serotonin down to 5-HT? Well, it's because its proper name in full is 5-hydroxytryptamine. So that's why we shorten that to 5-HT. So be aware, all of these 3 names can be used: serotonin, 5-HT, and 5-hydroxytryptamine. So that's the first example of a monoamine, easily the most famous of the monoamines, and this one's believed to be extremely important in regulating things like your mood. Now, next monoamine is noradrenaline, which we can abbreviate down to NA for short. Now, if you're in the United States, you don't like using noradrenaline, and there is another name, therefore, for noradrenaline, which is norepinephrine. Oh, and I've just about to spell that incorrectly, so good job I stopped that. So norepinephrine, spelt like so, and that can be abbreviated down to capital NE. So this is the second example of a monoamine neurotransmitter, and noradrenaline is believed to be extremely important in controlling energy levels. So we've had mood, we've had energy level, and the final one is dopamine, another very famous neurotransmitter. And dopamine can be abbreviated down to capital DA, and it's believed to be important in controlling things like volition. So this is my little foreshadowing of the monoamine hypothesis, actually. Mood is serotonin, noradrenaline is energy, and dopamine is volition. And you might now see how this theory is going to be extremely simple, probably over-optimistically simple. Now, so all of these molecules, they are monoamine neurotransmitters, and the reason they're called monoamines is that if we were to look at the chemical structures of all three of them, we would see that they all contain a single amine group. That's what it literally means. Mono means one, amine refers to an amine group, so they all have a single amine group in their chemical structures, hence why they're all referred to as the monoamine neurotransmitters. Now, these monoamine neurotransmitters then, as I say, very few neurons in the brain actually release these. So there are very few neurons in the brain that release serotonin, very few neurons in the brain that release noradrenaline, and very few neurons in the brain that release dopamine. And the neurons that do release these neurotransmitters within the brain are clustered into special areas within the brain. Okay, they are clustered all together. All of them have their cell bodies together in a certain little region in the brain. And when you have a cluster of cell bodies of neurons within the central nervous system, that is known as a nucleus. So the neurons that release these neurotransmitters are clustered together in nuclei. And these nuclei are present within the brainstem portion of the brain. So the brainstem, remember, is the continuation, effectively, of the spinal cord. We, in this little picture over here, have seen some examples of portions of the brainstem. Here is the medulla, then we have the pons, and then the final portion of the brainstem is not visible in this picture because it's inside of the cerebral hemispheres, but it's called the midbrain. So, in order to discuss the monoamine hypothesis any further, I want to show you where these nuclei that release these neurotransmitters are actually present within the brainstem, and therefore I want to draw you a little picture of the brainstem. So we'll do this down here. So this is going to be a very basic picture, but I'll do it here. So starting from the bottom, I'm drawing you the medulla, and I'm drawing it as though we are looking from the front. So, just to orient you, we are looking from the front. So, this is the right-hand side, and this is the left-hand side. Of course, this is patient's right-hand side, patient's left-hand side. Then, on top of the medulla, so this is, I'll just label it up, this is the medulla, the bottommost portion of the brainstem. On top of the medulla, you'll then have the pons. So, the pons is in this position here, like so. And then on top of the pons, you're going to have the final portion of the brainstem, which is the midbrain. Now, the midbrain has a slightly more complicated structure to show because it has the cerebral peduncles coming forward, which gives it that Mickey Mouse shape. So just bear with me whilst I draw this. So here is the right cerebral peduncle, here. Then we have the gap in between the two cerebral peduncles, here. And then we have the left cerebral peduncle in this position like so, and then the rest of the midbrain goes backwards with the superior colliculi there at the back. So this is my picture then of the midbrain, and I'll put the label up here. So all of these three pieces of the brain together, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla together, they are referred to as the brainstem, which is the continuation of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord would be connected below here, and the foramen magnum, the hole in the base of the skull, the big hole in the base of the skull, that's where the spinal cord goes through and to go into the vertebral column. Right, so all of the nuclei that contain the cells that release these monoamine neurotransmitters are going to be present within the brainstem. So let's begin then with serotonin. Let's start by having a look at where the nuclei of neurons that release serotonin as their neurotransmitter are present. So let me start by giving you the names of the nuclei that release serotonin as their neurotransmitter. They are called the raphe nuclei. Now, there are lots of raphe nuclei with very long and very complicated names. I'm not going to give you the names of all the different raphe nuclei. Instead, what I'm going to do is tell you roughly the position that the raphe nuclei are present within. So the raphe nuclei are present within a structure known as the reticular formation, which is a structure, a brainstem structure that runs all the way through the brainstem. And I'll try and sort of mark on the reticular formation here in my picture. So the reticular formation contains loads of different centers that are really important for controlling bodily functions. And it contains these raphe nuclei. So let me sort of show you the position of the reticular formation. So the way I'll do this is I'll start up here. We're seeing the top of the midbrain here. I'll show you where the reticular formation will be present, and then we'll draw it going down all the way through the brainstem here. So this is the position of the reticular formation. So it crosses the midline and it goes all the way across the width of the brainstem. And it's now going to go down. Let me just draw this carefully. So it comes down like this, all the way through, and it's towards the back of the brainstem overall. So here it is on the other side, coming down like this, and extending across the width of the brainstem. So I hope this kind of gets across the position of this thing. It is a section of tissue that runs all the way through the brainstem, and it's towards the back of the brainstem. At this top bit, you are seeing the position that it is in within the midbrain, but it remains towards the back as we go through the pons and as we go through the medulla here. So that is the reticular formation, and we can abbreviate that down to the RF. Now, important thing to remember, there is only one reticular formation. You do not talk about a left reticular formation and a right reticular formation. You refer to the whole thing as just being one reticular formation, one RF. Okay, right. So the raphe nuclei, these serotonergic nuclei, meaning that they release serotonin, these are present within the midline of the reticular formation here. So we can section this bit out here. So right down the midline of the reticular formation, here you'll have these raphe nuclei. Now you won't have them continuously. I'm not saying that the entire median portion of the reticular formation is made up by the raphe nuclei. What I am telling you is that all the different raphe nuclei that there are dotted along this line. So you can find lots of different raphe nuclei. If you were to go down the median reticular formation, you will find lots of the different raphe nuclei. So this is the rough position of them. So you have multiple different raphe nuclei. They're dotted along the median reticular formation, and they contain loads of neurons that release serotonin 5-hydroxytryptamine as their neurotransmitter. Excellent. So we know where the nuclei are now. What are they actually going to do? So the raphe nuclei then, they contain the cell bodies of all of the serotonergic neurons within the central nervous system. And out from the raphe nuclei come the axons of these serotonergic neurons. And here comes the really important bit to understand. These axons of the serotonergic neurons, they are going to go all over the central nervous system. So all over the central nervous system, there will be coming axons from serotonergic neurons that have their cell bodies within the raphe nuclei that are delivering serotonin to that portion of the brain, and that serotonin will be modulating the function of that portion of the brain. So the raphe nuclei, even though they are these tiny little structures within the median reticular formation within the brainstem, they actually have an extremely wide-reaching influence. Axons come out from the raphe nuclei that will go all over the brain. So just showing you this with the laser pointer, let's say that there's a raphe nucleus here. Axons from that raphe nucleus will go all over the place in different directions to all the different portions of the brain, and then they'll have axons going downwards to the spinal cord. So the entire central nervous system receives serotonergic input from the raphe nuclei, and therefore these raphe nuclei have a modulatory role on the entire brain. They control the behavior of the entire brain. And the monoamine hypothesis now conjectures that the thing that they correlate to is mood, that serotonin release all over the brain corresponds to mood, and indeed we are studying the monoamine hypothesis. So if you believe this theory, you believe that serotonin correlates to mood. And most people know this. This has become common knowledge that serotonin has something to do with mood. So to absolutely spell this out then, when the raphe nuclei serotonergic neurons are very active and they're releasing a lot of serotonin all over the brain, that will correspond to high mood according to this hypothesis. Whereas when the serotonin is low, that will correspond to low mood. So this broad regulatory function that the serotonin is having on the entire brain is then corresponding to what we actually feel as mood. That is the monoamine hypothesis's view or hypothesis about the function of serotonin then. Right, so enough of serotonin. Let's now move on to noradrenaline. So again, firstly we need to discuss where the nuclei actually are that are going to contain the noradrenergic neurons. And then we need to discuss, according to the monoamine hypothesis, what is noradrenaline level believed to correlate to. So the nuclei that contain the noradrenergic neurons, these are present within the pons, and they are called the loci cerebrei, or singular local cerebrius. So loci cerebrei, spelt like so. So if you wanted to turn this into the singular, you would take off the I here, and you would put US for locus cerebrius, and of course you would have to turn the loci into locus as well. So there are these two nuclei on either side called the loci cerebrei, and there is a left locus cerebrius and a right locus cerebrius. So let me show you roughly on my picture of the brainstem here where they are positioned. So they're positioned behind the pontine reticular formation. So at this sort of level that I'm adding them in here now. So imagine behind this layer of reticular formation in the pons, behind that you then have these two blobs, and these are the two loci cerebrei. So this is the left locus cerebrius, and this is the right locus cerebrius, and both of these contain the cell bodies of noradrenergic neurons. And again, just like I've just described for the raphe nuclei, even though these are tiny little structures and you wouldn't expect them to have that much influence, the axons of the noradrenergic neurons that they contain will go off in all the different directions you can imagine, and therefore these two tiny little nuclei are going to supply tissues all over the central nervous system with noradrenaline. So the influence of the loci cerebrei, as was the influence of the raphe nuclei, is massive. And again, noradrenaline then is released all over the central nervous system, and again is believed to play some global modulatory function on the entire brain. And that global modulatory function is believed to be energy level, according to the monoamine hypothesis. So noradrenaline level then is believed to correlate to energy. So serotonin level all over the central nervous system correlates to mood. Noradrenaline level is believed to correlate to energy level. And again, it's the case that the more noradrenaline you have, the higher will be your energy. The lower the noradrenaline that you have is, the lower will be your energy level. So, this now puts us in a position to describe what the monoamine hypothesis has to say about depressive episodes, because we don't need dopamine to explain depressive episodes. We do need that when we come on to manic episodes, but serotonin and noradrenaline is enough as far as explaining depressive episodes is concerned. So remember, in a depressive episode, you have a prolonged period where you have low mood, called dysphoria, and anergia. And according to the monoamine hypothesis, that corresponds to having low serotonin and low noradrenaline for a long period of time. So I'm just going to add that in up here. So I'll pick a new colour to do this in. So we'll have, I think, aquamarine. We haven't used that previously. So in a depressive episode then, what's believed to happen according to the monoamine hypothesis is that serotonin, which I'll abbreviate down to 5-HT, is believed to be too low, and also the noradrenaline level is believed to be too low. And just adding a few arrows on, noradrenaline being too low is believed to cause the anergia, and serotonin being too low is believed to cause the dysphoria. Okay, so too low serotonin, low mood, too low noradrenaline is believed to cause anergia. Now, of course, your next question should be, so if I have an individual with unipolar depression, how do they actually end up with too low serotonin and too low noradrenaline? How do they actually end up suffering from these depressive episodes? What goes wrong with their monoaminergic system, specifically the serotonergic system and the noradrenaline system, that leads to these neurotransmitters being far too low all over the central nervous system? And I'm afraid the answer to that is where there's going to be a hole in my explanation. I can't answer that. We don't understand. That bit is very, very controversial. What I can say is that if you have an individual suffering from unipolar depression, something we believe is wrong with the monoaminergic system that makes them susceptible to suffering from these depressive episodes, where for huge long periods of time, the amount of serotonin and the amount of noradrenaline that is being released all over the central nervous system is far too low, and that leads to these depressive episodes. And if you just suffer from unipolar depression, then all that ever happens is in the episodes, serotonin goes down and noradrenaline goes down, rather than the changes that can occur in bipolar disorder that will give rise to manic episodes, which we'll discuss now. Okay, so to discuss what the monoamine hypothesis has to say about manic episodes, we now need to go to the third of the examples of monoamines that I've put here. We need to discuss dopamine, and then we can discuss what happens in a manic episode, or what is believed to happen in a manic episode. So same procedure again. We need to go over where are the nuclei that contain the dopaminergic neurons. So there are two major examples of dopaminergic nuclei within the brainstem, and these are the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. So again, big names, but I'll show you roughly on the picture that we have of the brainstem where these are. So we'll start with something called the substantia nigra, very, very important in volition, famously important in motor volition, and indeed that's what dopamine is going to correlate to in the monoamine hypothesis. Serotonin was mood, noradrenaline was energy, dopamine is now going to be volition. So, let me show you where the substantia nigra are then, and then we'll do ventral tegmental area. So I'll do these in this light mint green colour. So these are in the midbrain, and they're in front of the reticular formation within the midbrain. So in the mint green here, in the cerebral peduncles, or just behind the cerebral peduncles, I should say more correctly. So these are the cerebral peduncles here. Just at the base here, you will have the substantia nigras, and you have a left substantia nigra here and a right substantia nigra here. They are in front of the midbrain reticular formation here. So whilst the loci coeruleae were behind the pontine reticular formation, the substantia nigra and also the ventral tegmental area that I'll show you in a moment, they're going to be in front of the midbrain reticular formation. So that's the substantia nigra. Next, let's do the ventral tegmental area. So firstly, let me write this out in full. So another dopaminergic nucleus is the ventral tegmental area. And for short, the ventral tegmental area is abbreviated down to the VTA. So it's quite difficult to put this in my picture because I've shown the reticular formation being so far forward, but this is an area in the middle here, in between the two substantia nigras there. So we have our left substantia nigra, then in the middle here you have the ventral tegmental area, just one of them in the middle, and then you have the right substantia nigra over here, and these are the three dopaminergic nuclei here. So these areas of the midbrain contain absolutely loads of the cell bodies of dopaminergic neurons. So those are the dopaminergic nuclei then within the midbrain level of the brainstem. Again, the same thing is true here. The axons from these dopaminergic neurons within these nuclei are going to come out of the nuclei, and they're going to go to loads of regions of the brain and release dopamine in those regions of the brain, and that dopamine is going to have an effect, a modulatory effect on the function of those far off portions of the brain. So exactly the same holds true as what I've said about the raphe nuclei and the loci coeruleae. Even though these are small, localized structures, they have a very wide spreading influence, a very wide influence on brain function. So, dopamine then, it's believed to be the correlate of volition. So I'll put this here. So dopamine is believed to correlate to volition. It's believed to correlate to how easily the brain potentiates or promotes up thoughts. The more dopamine you have, the easier you will find it to promote up thoughts. The more disinhibited you will be, the quicker you will think, the quicker you will be able to talk. And then if you have massive dopamine, you may even end up potentiating up thoughts that you absolutely do not want to be potentiated up. These little thoughts about sensory information that is not there, that we believe may be present in all people's brains as a way for the sensory cortexes to practice processing information, and you may therefore end up with psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, and delusional beliefs. Okay, so dopamine is believed to be the correlate of volition. The more dopamine you have, the easier it is to promote up thoughts. The less dopamine you have, the lower your volition. So when you are very, very ill and it's very, very difficult for you to talk, you find it, you have to put in much more effort to make conversation to people, and it's much more effort to walk to the shops and buy things. That will correlate to a reduction in the amount of dopamine, according to the Monoamine hypothesis anyway, within your brain. Okay, so those are the three monoamines: serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine, and these are the things that they are believed to contribute to. So what we have overall seen is that they are all neurotransmitters that are going to be released all over the brain and which are going to modulate very global whole brain functions such as mood, energy level, and volition. So we can now discuss what is believed then to be happening in a manic episode according to the monoamine hypothesis. So depressive episode, remember, correlated to low serotonin and low noradrenaline for a long period of time that gave rise to the low mood and the low energy level. Let's now talk about what the manic episodes will correspond to according to the monoamine hypothesis. So let's start off with a depressive manic episode, which I've said is the more common type of manic episode to experience in bipolar disorder. So this is extremely simple to work out. Look at the symptoms that I have put here, and we can work it out extremely simply. And this is one of the incredible beauties of this theory, and why it would be so wonderful if it actually turns out to be true, that it is extremely simple. So, in a depressive manic episode, we know that your mood is down, so we would expect, therefore, the serotonin level to be reduced. So 5-HT is going to be reduced. We know that your energy level is right up. So we know that that will correspond to increased noradrenaline. So noradrenaline is now going to be too high, exactly the opposite of what happens in a depressive episode where noradrenaline is too low. In addition, to get the increased volition that occurs in a manic episode, that will correspond to the being too much dopamine. So that's believed to be what happens in a depressive manic episode. Serotonin goes down, which gives rise to the dysphoria, but noradrenaline and dopamine go up, which gives rise to the very different symptoms that occur in a manic episode from what happens in a depressive episode, the increase in energy and the increase in volition. Right, and again, of course, you should now ask, well, if this is what happens in a depressive manic episode, how does that actually occur? If we've got someone suffering from bipolar disorder, why do they end up having this episode where serotonin is far too low and noradrenaline is far too high and dopamine is far too high? And the answer is we don't currently understand that. Again, that's where there is a hole in my explanation. All I can say is, if this theory is correct, then in an individual with bipolar disorder, somehow their brain must be susceptible to misfunctions in the monoamine system, and they are susceptible to this sort of misfunction in the monoamine system where the serotonin is going to be far too high for a long period of time, serotonin is going to be far too low for a long period of time, whilst the noradrenaline and dopamine that's being released is going to be far too high. And then it can correct and they can come back down to a normal level for a while, and then they can have another episode. But they're also, of course, susceptible to the depressive episodes, so they can also get periods where both serotonin and noradrenaline are far too high, whilst dopamine remains at a normal level. So now let's go over what must happen in a euphoric manic episode, so hopefully you can complete this in for yourself. In a euphoric manic episode, absolutely everything is believed to go up. So to become euphoric, that needs 5-HT to go up. So 5-HT goes up, noradrenaline goes up, and dopamine goes up. So all of the monoamines go up in a euphoric manic episode. But as I've said, in my experience, this is not a particularly common type of manic episode. The more common is the depressive manic episode, where your mood is bad, but your energy and volition is through the roof. Okay, and again, I cannot give you the explanation as to why these disturbances in monoaminergic function occur in an individual with bipolar disorder. The theory at this point doesn't really give an explanation for that, or at least the explanations that are present are extremely controversial at present. So all I'm going to do is explain to you what this monoamine hypothesis says may be the correlate of each of these types of episodes, but I'm not going to be able to give you the explanation of why individuals with these disorders are susceptible to these disturbances in monoamine function. Right, so that's all I want to say about the monoamine hypothesis. We'll have a break here, and in the next video we'll move on to discuss the treatment for bipolar disorder.